Hello and welcome to the Lifting the Iceberg podcast. I'm your host, Tyler James Berger, and on this episode, I sit down with Delvin Solkinson. Delvin is a permaculture design expert who has traveled the world to study the principles, patterns, and processes found in nature to improve human systems ranging from agriculture, politics, renewable energy, and to even spirituality and religion. We get into all of that and more on this episode, so without any further ado, please welcome Delvin Solkinson. So I'm sitting here with Delvin Solkinson, and we're about to lift the iceberg on permaculture and permaculture design. So my first question, let's just start with, what is permaculture? What is it for? Who is it for? What can we learn from it?
Permaculture is like a postmodern collection of indigenous wisdom and knowledge from traditional peoples, combined with new scientific discoveries about how the world works, how nature works. Essentially, the idea is that nature is this incredibly well-designed system that we're a part of. And the secret of nature's success, the reason why we're here today talking on a podcast, is because nature's designed incredibly well. And that design system, which we can articulate as an operating system or a series of design principles, is really the reason why everything has worked on our planet.
Yeah.
So permaculture looks at these principles and says, how can we apply these to our own decisions and designs, not only in the garden and the farm, but in economics, in politics, in spirituality?
Yeah, I mean, nature has had millions of years of research and development that, like, it's so arrogant of us to think that we can invent a system that works better than what nature is already using. You know, the evolutionary process like selects what works and throws out what doesn't. And nature's already been doing that for so long, so we don't have to. You know, what are some permaculture design ideas that are floating around in terms of how to grow and cultivate food, whether it be on mass scales or more locally? Like, what can permaculture teach us on, like, how to reinvent our agriculture industry?
Well, the system we look to is the forest.
Yeah.
Every piece of land on the planet wants to become an old-growth forest, and if left on its own, it will. And that old-growth forest will clean the air and clean the water and build the soil and create food and habitat for an increasingly diverse amount of creatures, including us. And it does that in a way that doesn't cause any waste at all. Like, it's zero footprint. So the longer nature does its thing, the better the world gets. So we are a part of nature, but when we look at our agriculture system and the way we garden and farm, we have a huge impact. We essentially cut down the rainforest, this super amazing system that's totally diverse and super productive. And then we till the soil and we plant predominantly annual vegetables.
Yeah.
So in permaculture, we're looking at, like, how can we design our food systems that act more like a forest, that make the world around a better place while creating this really diverse abundance of food, and also that's really resilient to climate and resilient to things that are happening. So it's kind of the opposite in some ways of the agricultural system, which is like in the succession of a forest, we go from nothing to this ancient growth forest. And in the agriculture system, it's almost like we're keeping it at the beginning set of succession where we're clear cutting it every year and it's down to bare soil.
And planting the same thing. Like, where in nature do you ever see, like, acres and acres of land with the same exact plant or the same exact organism on it? It's something that is really interesting to me about permaculture is the use of polyculture, like planting different plants that work symbiotically together and affect the growth and development, and they're all just kind of like working together. I thought that was really interesting because I saw this video of a farmer kind of like he didn't just get in a machine and just till the field. He had to go out and like kind of look for the stuff he wanted to harvest because it was all kind of like he had maybe 10 different food sources growing in this one area. Something else that I think is fascinating is the intentional use of mycelium to help nutrient transfer in soil. We've heard that that is something that happens naturally in the forest, but that can also be something that is intentionally used in modern gardening. That's so cool. What experience do you have with like using mushrooms as a tool to help enhance like a garden?
Well, I mean, from the study of the forest, we see that the mycorrhiza, which are the soil builders in nature, are responsible not only for that nutrient transfer, but also for creating fertile soil and turning nutrient and dead matter into rich soil that can feed the plants itself. It's interesting because in the way that we're gardening and farming in conventional world, as well as the way we're doing business, our focus is on efficiency.
Yeah.
And the lesson of nature is that it's actually about being effective. And that contains efficiency in it, but it's longer term, it's regenerative, it's resilient, it's takes care of everything, not just focused on production and how can we get the most with the least.
Yeah, and that's kind of the bias of our capitalistic system right now. Like, grow as much as possible, make the most amount of profit as possible. And it's kind of like this idea of like mining and extracting value, not existing in a way that adds value to everything around you, and in so doing lifts you up. It's like maybe we can find a new eco-capitalist system where the wealth of humanity increases, but only along with the health of the natural world. How can permaculture inform our like political systems? Like, what designs or what processes of nature do you feel can be like mapped onto the way we conduct ourselves politically?
Interesting question. One of the frames for permaculture on energy and resources that I think applies as much to the garden as it does to education or the political landscape. And this is from one of my teachers, Toby Hemingway in Portland, passed away a couple years ago, that there's three kind of types of energy and resources in the human world and the natural world. One is degenerative resources. And these are things that when we use them, we pollute the world around, and we use them up, so they're no longer available. So in the natural world, this might be like oil or nuclear energy, fossil fuels. And so we know, well, we can't really have a world based on using degenerative resources. And in the political landscape, it's also based on a similar short-term thinking. Like, let's use up a bunch of the resources, and those might be people or those might be money that we have, so that we can get these short-term yields, because we're just thinking about in political terms about like how long we're in office and how we could potentially get reelected or at least satisfy the people that voted us in. The second type of resources are sustainable resources, where when we use them, we still pollute the world around, but they can be replenished. So in the ecological system, that's a lot of the plant systems, the forest. It takes 1,000 years to grow back. So it's, solar energy, wind energy. We don't really have the technology to use sustainable resources sustainably, but at least nature has the ability to regenerate them. And in the political landscape, that has a lot to do with human resources, skills, the labor force, where we're using resources that are we can sustain using them over and over. At least they're not getting used up.
Yeah.
But the powerhouse of permaculture is the regenerative power of nature, where the natural system has the ability to use these sustainable resources truly sustainably with no impact, that it turns the sun and the wind and the air and the water into life, which begets more life. And the longer we leave it, the better everything gets. And in the political landscape, we really need to think about that. What are the resources that we have? And that comes down to a people in many ways. How to use the resources that we have. And these may be people that have been marginalized or that we're not using as effectively as we could, and really like uplift our community to contribute in a positive way and create more natural systems that will stabilize climate change, clean the air, clean the water, build more soil, provide more food, help us relocalize our economy, and tackle the problems that we really need to face. And in the political landscape, that's long-term thinking of how can we address the problems that the human and ecological community are facing with an eye to kind of long-term solutions and not just trying to do Band-Aid solutions in the short term.
For sure. And, something I think about is the earth is so powerful in it and so wise in its system, Gaia, you could say. And we often frame the current situation that we're in as human beings are carelessly utilizing nature, so much so as to be destroying it. But I think that the frame that I've been playing with is borrowed from George Carlin when he says that it's not that we're destroying nature, it's that like the earth is going to shake us off like a bad case of fleas, if we continue on this path that we're on, where it's like we might be the keystone species, where it's the species that affects the growth and production of all other species around it. But if we're not working in symbiosis with the rest of the planet is just going to retaliate and it like an immune response and somehow affect our own growth, whether it be like, is there any way where nature will retaliate against a keystone species that changes its behavior to become like parasitic? Do you know what I mean? Like, if we don't treat nature with respect and diligence, like, is nature just gonna like shake us off like a bad case of fleas?
Well, we really need to get reconnected.
Yeah.
So there's a major fallacy in the mythology of our civilization, which is that we are separate from nature.
Yeah.
We've kind of villainized nature and we've said like culture versus nature. And in reality, we are as natural as a bunny rabbit or a tree. We're totally part of the natural process. It's completely inescapable. So the irony of this us and it kind of dichotomy is that we require healthy air and healthy water. We require plants to feed us and to turn the sun's energy into food.
Yeah.
So the more that we pollute the natural world, it's like we're actually polluting ourselves.
We're just
and,
killing ourselves.
A lot of
Exactly.
this cancer rates and healthcare issues and the health crisis that humanity's in is because our home, which takes care of us, which we're a part of, we've kind of trashed. So I think it's less that nature would act against us, and it's more that we're acting against ourselves by our own behavior. And there's this sense that we need to wake up and realize that we're only harming ourselves. And by using up the Earth's resources, we're harming future generations of humans.
Yeah.
So hopefully the ecological crisis that we're in now will wake people up to the reality that we are one with nature, and that any of the destruction that we do to nature or using up of these core resources on the planet will really just be to our own detriment, not to our advantage.
One of my favorite quotes is by a guy named Theodore Roszak, who wrote a book called Eco-Psychology. And he said that if the self can be extended to include the natural world, any behaviors leading to the destruction of that world will be experienced as self-destruction. So I love this idea of extending our sense of self to include our local and global environment, because if we're damaging the rest of nature, we realize that we are damaging ourselves. And I think people are inherently selfish, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing if all of nature is included in that self. And I think one of the great ways of extending your sense of self boundlessly into everything is the use of psychedelics, specifically ayahuasca. You know, you hear a lot of people taking ayahuasca, whether it be, going down to the jungle, or doing it anywhere else in the world. And one of the common experiences is a realization of unity with nature. And I think that is one of the most powerful, transformative elements of the ayahuasca experience. And do you know anything about how indigenous communities that have integrated some kind of sacramental psychedelic ceremonies into their culture, how does their behavior towards the natural world differ than the kind of Eurocentric model that we're living in right now? Do you know anything about
Yeah, I mean, that's
cultures?
really where permaculture's from.
Yeah.
One of the core realizations of permaculture in its study of indigenous cultures and its being sort of a lineage carrier for these traditions is that the reason that we've survived so long is, and that the ecological crisis is so recent. I mean, it's only the last 500, 800 years that we've started to really destroy the planet we live on. There's tens of thousands of years that humans lived in symbiosis with nature. And it seems like before the advent of modern religion, that indigenous cultures were inherently shamanic, meaning their spirituality was based on a direct connection to nature. And the more we research this, and we realize that a lot of the mystical experience that they were able to cultivate actually comes from plants that nature provided. And these plants, created a sense of the sacred and a sense of connection. And out of that comes the core ethics of permaculture, which is care for people, care for the planet, and care for the future. Not necessarily in that order. I mean, they're all intertwined and nested into each other. So this is the kind of realization that the reason the Earth survived for so long is because all indigenous spirituality was based inherently not only on a harmonious connection to nature, but on a mystical spiritual experience based in plant medicines that nature provided. And to me, that's echoed in the kind of Garden of Eden myth of like eating something from the natural world that gives you the sense of oneness and connection and appreciation and gratitude and kind of uplifts you to higher values. Yeah.
I love this idea of psychedelics, the plant-based psychedelics being an alamone. And an alamone is a chemical that one plant or species produces that affects the growth and reproduction of another species. So this is kind of like the flower and the bee. Like the flower produces, pollen and the scent that draws in the bee and helps the flower reproduce and pretty much like have sex all over the place. But this also helps the bee promote its own growth and reproduction. And they're in this kind of symbiotic tangle. And I think that ayahuasca and psilocybin and cannabis could potentially be alamones, like chemicals that the plant kingdom have, quote unquote, intentionally developed to affect our species to behave in a way that is conducive to the plant world's betterment and growth. What do you think of that idea? Do you think that we could have co-evolved with these substances and the plant kingdom kind of in a plant's own wisdom? Because I don't want to use the word intention, because it's not clear that plants have intention, so to speak, but there is a type of wisdom there. Do you think that psychedelics could have, quote unquote, intentionally have been developed in the plant kingdom to cause human beings to behave in a way that will help save this planet for the betterment of the plants?
I love that idea. That's totally brilliant. Yeah, it's interesting because taking a page from Michael Pollan in The Botany of Desire, these plant medicines that have been used since far before the beginning of recorded history have been successful themselves in the ecosystem because they have been cared for and planted out and cultivated by humans. So in that way, also, we've kind of been planted on the planet as our own type of psychedelic to actually support the successful growth and evolution and spreading of these particular plants. So on some level, on the other level, we might be the exact same for those plants that actually we've been placed in the ecosystem to make sure that those particular plants that have a kind of intelligence, whether it's intentional or not, that have this deep intelligence. So we've been placed here really as caretaker stewards for the natural world, and particularly to help certain species of plants, and the entheogens are certainly some of them, these sacraments, to be successful on Earth.
Well, one of my favorite Terence McKenna quotes is animals are just something plants invented to spread seeds around. I think that's brilliant. Now, you talked a bit about patterns in nature being mapped onto human systems, and this, of course, is known as the field of biomimicry, kind of mimicking biology and seeing what we can gain from that. The classic example is solar power. Clearly, we're mimicking the biology of a leaf. And in a lot of these indigenous cultures, I think it's interesting to see evidence of biomimetic spirituality, you know, where in a lot of indigenous cultures, they were named after animals or plants, or so much so that when you're named after something in the natural world, that's a great way to identify with it, you know. And also, that is not something that is not so indigenous. I thought it was really powerful when Bruce Lee said, we should be like water. You know, water, you put water into a teacup, it becomes the teacup. When you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. Or water can flow or it can crash. Water can be soft, but over the course of thousands of years, carve canyons. And I just thought it was so brilliant how he took the nature and behavior of water and extracted processes that we can apply to our own life, you know. And this is biomimetic spirituality, like how we should conduct ourselves in the same way that water flows in a stream. Do you know of any other examples of a spiritual tradition taking things in nature and mapping it onto their own ceremonial practices or anything like that?
That's great. Well, permaculture really does start with biomimicry, and there's sort of two levels. Mm-hmm. There's the physical level, the visible structures, we call it in permaculture, and then there's the invisible structures, which I can start with the visible structures. I mean, most of our technology is based on things we found in the natural world, you know, spirals and circles within circles and spheres. And we look at the function of the actual form of nature, and we say, well, we want to replicate that function, so we can replicate the form in nature. Mm. Water is an interesting example because, like, the permaculture principle in the ecosystem is the slow spread, sink, and store. That's from Jeff Lawton. And so in successful natural systems, and if you look at just the function of geography, is that it's really trying to use water many, many, many times in the water's journey from the top of high places back to the ocean. So we're trying to slow the flow of water, make it rub up and touch as many things as possible so it can give life to as many things as possible. Cycle it a few times, clean it, clear it, and then eventually pass it out to the ocean. And we look at currency, which is also about flow, money, essentially, as the same, having the same principles.
Yeah.
Is that in a relocalized economy, we really want to slow the flow of water, cycle it so we're using it again and again before it flows out into the sort of great ocean of the global economic system. So we're trying to find these little pockets where we can slow it, store it for short periods of time, and use it and reuse it over and over again. So in that way, the same kind of principle of water in the ecosystem relates to the way that we can successfully run sort of small local economies. And in terms of spirituality, I feel like the origin of religion has to do with the miracle of nature. And it just sprung here at Cosm Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, and we've been talking about the Visionary Permaculture program here. And I've been listening to the birds sing and the animals, you know, seeing the deer run around in delight at the new fresh green shoots. And I feel like the animals reflect this base spirituality where they go through the night on a tiny term, or they go through the seasons on a longer term, and they don't necessarily have the same pattern recognition, where they don't have that same expectation, like, oh, it's just winter, spring's going to come. Oh, it's just night, the morning's going to come. And each time that the sun rises, or each time that the spring arrives, there's this joy at the miracle of rebirth, that like nature is providing food and warmth for them again. And I feel like the core of these shamanic religions that are at the origin of human consciousness shared that same awe and reverence for being alive, and awe and reverence for nature and these natural cycles. are kind of, I think, at the root of mythology, this sense of rebirth, that these natural cycles spawned the first religions, which were nature religions, which were goddess religions, which were essentially worshiping creation in modern terms as the force of nature, and just honoring and wanting to support that and be in alignment with that mysterious force that provides everything that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I live in New York City, and my connection to the cycles of nature is severely cut off, like just completely severed. You know, most nights I can't even see where the moon is, can't see the stars, can't see if trees are blooming. I sometimes will go 2 weeks without even stepping on earth, without even stepping on soil. I'm just on sidewalks and elevators and subways, and I'm just completely cut off from any kind of visible appreciation for the processes of nature. And I think that's one of the reasons why the city is so draining for a lot of people, and why a lot of people, or at least me, feel the need to come out to places like the Hudson Valley. And just kind of, when I'm out here, I just feel like I'm a dry sponge that just got thrown into a river. You know, I feel like I'm soaking something up. And I think it really has to do with feeling the vibration of all the different plants and animals around me, feeling the fresh air, and getting to that kind of baseline gratitude for nature and what it gives to us. It really is. It may be the thing that's constantly trying to kill us, but it's also the only thing that gives us life. And when you're sitting in nature, when you're just marinating in it, that becomes so evident, and you just naturally, this gratitude just naturally bubbles up from within you. And that's such an inspiring, that's the inspiration for so much art, you know. And you know that that's a good segue into the art world. What role could an artist have in communicating the wisdom of nature for the rest of us? You know, because of course you're very much so connected to the visionary art community. Do you see any intersection between the artist's mission and the permaculturalist's mission?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're kind of bridging that here at Cosm Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, this idea that the world is so enmeshed in its own media that for a lot of people, since they're in an urban context, art in the form of paintings, but also photography and video and podcasts like this one can start to bridge an interest and inspire people to go out and get reconnected and find a sit spot in nature and get connected in this biomimetic way, as we were talking about, to the original awe and wonder and reverence for being alive by seeing how interconnected nature is and the miracle that life creates life, and that nature gets better and takes care of all these problems on its own if we leave it alone, and that we can make direct contact in this really awe-inspiring way. So the vision of the artist really is to connect people up, not only to the nature on the planet, but also our inner nature, because we're part of nature, and the outer nature in terms of the cosmic context. Because all of those things, the wonders of the inner world that can be unlocked by plant medicines, the wonders of the natural world that we can sense, and also the wonders of the cosmic sort of universe around us, and how amazing it is that life would be able to cultivate itself on our planet in this really unique way. So I do see the vision, as Terence McKenna said, the mission of the artist is to redeem humanity and inspire us to return to this role that we always had as sort of gardener, caretaker, stewards of the planetary ecosystem.
I think Terence McKenna also said, like, if the artist cannot find the way cannot be found. I love that. And, you know, you hear in a lot of different religious traditions the kind of archetypal story of the man or woman leaving society and going into nature for an extended period of time, whether it be 40 days or sitting in a cave for 40 years. There's this perennial story of the person escaping the social system and going to sit in nature, and as if there's some deep wisdom that can only be gained outside of the collective social system and in nature. What do you think that story is all about?
That's really interesting. Well, as I said at the beginning, in permaculture, when we're looking at nature as a type of operating system and seeing that the secret to nature's success, which is also our success since we're part of nature, is understanding a series of principles and strategies and methods and techniques and attitudes, that we can discover all this wisdom through direct observation of the natural world, and that the basis for everything that we've learned and our potential to evolve really comes from learning nature's design system. And all of our technology that we have, from high tech to low tech, is all inspired from nature, whether that's the natural world around us or the nature of our own minds and how we understand the world around us. So it kind of all comes back to nature. You know, our pharmacon is all based on plant medicines. Our computers are all mimicking forms and functions that we've observed in nature. So it really does all spring from nature, and it all comes back to nature. And maybe that's one of the secrets for us to out-evolve this current situation, is to get really reconnected with the natural world in order to get really reconnected to ourselves and kind of have this source inspiration that the wisdom and the intelligence of nature has so much to offer us, and we can care for it and create the conditions for it to clean the air, clean the water, provide food. We can create the conditions for nature to do its thing, which inevitably benefits us and will take us to the next level.
But, you know, sometimes I think the almighty yin yang expresses itself in everything, especially in nature. And, you know, there's that, what is that kind of beetle that is just decimating?
The pine beetle.
The pine beetle. Yeah. And, you know, the pine beetle is obviously a part of nature, you know, but at the same time, it's killing so much life. And you want to maybe tell me if I have this right. Maybe if you create a system that is healthy and grounded, it will have a natural immune response to other forces of nature that might just want to like devour and eat and just have a parasitic relationship to it. But how do you, from a permaculture standpoint, treat like parasitic organisms? Like, clearly there must be natural pesticides that are used in permaculture, because you don't want some kind of species to just proliferate out of control and kill everything, because the parasite is a very real form of nature, you know, a form of nature that manifests itself across time and space like that. There's always the parasitic process that a lot of organisms take up. How do you treat that?
Well, it's interesting because everything works both ways is one of the permaculture principles. And the pine beetle itself is a symptom of climate change. It has to do with the temperature not going down enough in the winter to break the pest cycle. In permaculture, reframe for pests and parasites are opportunistic species. And the reason why our planet...
reframe. So you reframe it not as parasites, but opportunistic. So
exactly.
You cut out the opportunity.
You cut out the opportunity. So the reason that our planet hasn't been decimated by the plague or disease or any of these parasites or any of these illnesses or diseases, none of them have destroyed the planet, is because the permaculture principle, the problem is the solution, is that when nature gets out of balance, everything is food for something else. So those pine beetles are food for another species. And one of the dynamic ways that nature works is that because there's this food chain and everything's food for something else, when one species gets out of balance, another species will come in and become really successful by eating that species. Then they'll kind of get successful and another species will come and take them out. So also think that it is a message. I was interviewing Julia Butterfly Hill, this woman in California who lived in this tree for a really long time to protect the forests of California. Mm-hmm. And I said, you've been living in nature for so long, what's the message of nature? You're probably more connected than most. And she said, the message of nature is that it's communicating. It's always been communicating, and we've forgotten how to listen. We've forgotten the language of nature. Mm-hmm. And to me, the pine beetle is a form of communication, saying to us, hey, your industrial practices are resulting in climate change, which is throwing the ecosystem out of balance.
You're not just looking at it as like this evil little bug.
Yeah.
You're not like ascribing moral value to it. You're just seeing it as a symptom of a much deeper issue.
Yeah, and a specific communication for nature to say, hey, you are causing chaos in your own world by throwing things out of balance. So, I mean, the solution to the pine beetle is not pesticides. The solution to the pine beetle is restabilizing the ecosystem.
Wow.
And the permaculture perspective is that any plant disease or any plant pest is caused exclusively because the plant is not in the conditions for it to grow. It's the soil's off, the sun's off, the water's off, the airflow's off. Something is off. And it's not, the pest isn't really a problem. It's an indicator that the conditions are not right for that plant system or animal system to grow.
Wow.
And that's, the immune system's been compromised in some way. So that, it's almost the opposite. It's like these things are not problems. They're communications and messages to check the conditions in which we're living or animals are living or plants are living.
Wow. That's amazing. That's so cool. That's such a positive reframing of a whole situation. And it's a much more conducive way of looking at that kind of situation because it actually influences positive behaviors that will help the whole system rather than just, let's find the strongest pesticide and just take these things down. Wow.
Exactly. And that's really what we need. I was just taking some classes with Ian McKenzie, who was involved in this Occupy Love movie. And his reframe, who's asking all these environmentalists and activists, is how is the current ecological crisis part of the greatest love story that's ever happened on the planet? And this is the type of reframing that we need. We need to take out this us and them, human versus nature versus culture, and really think that it's all one thing and it's all a message. And we can learn from nature, we can get the message, and we can change our behavior based on the message. So it's really a big artistic, creative collaboration that we're undergoing with nature.
Well, you're doing a great job with helping influence people to change their behaviors with your permaculture design deck and your permaculture design books. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're offering right now?
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I've spent the last 16 years traveling the planet and studying from the key permaculture elders and going to the oldest permaculture sites so I can be immersed in the models and be learning directly from these elders who really got their knowledge from a lot of indigenous traditions and also their own observation of nature and science as well. And everywhere I've gone and all the classes I've taken, I've taken really good notes. And I've really tried to essentialize the core learnings that I've gotten from the permaculture design system and put them into a series of free open source learning tools that I'm working on putting into a bunch of different languages as well. So there's a deck of cards, which is 230 permaculture principles, which is sort of part of the core lesson of nature, the operating system of nature. Then there's a permaculture design notes book, which is the core curriculum for the permaculture design course, which really looks at cultivating a pattern literacy and understanding about successful and unsuccessful patterns in our own world and in the natural world and any systems we create. Cultivating a different type of ecological literacy of understanding how the natural system works and how we can help create the conditions for it to work effectively. And cultivating a design literacy so we can apply these concepts to the way that we're designing education, governance, city planning, wildlife planning, and certainly agriculture. And changing the way that we're thinking about designing all of the systems that fulfill our basic needs. And then there's a teacher's notes book, which is the best practices, top tips, and do's and don'ts for teaching, because it all comes down to education. So really trying to empower people to recognize that they're already teachers. In permaculture, it's not seeking to generate students. It's seeking to empower people to realize they're already teachers, and they can improve on their ability to teach, whether it's informally by talking to friends, or more formally in podcasts or teaching classes. But everyone really is a teacher. And permaculture wants to empower people to acknowledge and realize this, that they all have something to share, not only with other people, but also with themselves.
Yeah. So where can people go to find this stuff?
Visionarypermaculture.com or dopermaculture.com has a ton of free resources. Not only these 3 listed, but all sorts of learning tools, videos, audio casts, and tons of resources to help support you on your journey, help support anyone on their journey to become more conscious designers of their lives, their landscapes, and their livelihoods.
And you're also working on the Galactic Oracle trading cards. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, part of the thing with these cities and this idea that there's all this concrete and all this hard technology, since we're totally a part of nature, there's nothing unnatural about downtown of New York. I mean, it's just as natural as a forest, because everything on our planet is part of the natural system. And I feel like it's sort of an uncomfortable period in our evolution, that what the earth is really birthing in us is a spacefaring civilization. And we're just in a process where it's really messy, and we're doing a lot of damage to the system that we're a part of. But I feel ultimately it's totally a natural process in which we're becoming ready to be a galactic civilization and explore the cosmos, journey out to other universes, and discover life in other forms. So the Galactic Trading Cards is a sort of a social permaculture initiative to connect with artists all over the world. There's artists from 40 countries involved that are expressing this visionary impulse to see nature in a sacred way, to see humanity in a sacred way, and also to envision a really positive and uplifting future for ourselves. So similar to the permaculture design deck, the 230 principles that have been condensed into a kind of nature oracle, the Galactic Trading Cards is also oracular in nature. And this is a basic formula of permaculture, that the way that we can be the most effective in our lives and the things we're designing is by getting creative. And that good oracular systems, good oracles, good divinatory systems don't tell us what to do. They help us get out of our own way. They help us get out of our own box. They give us creative processes in which we can frame the problems and the solutions in new ways. And that's sort of the point of the Galactic Trading Cards and also the Permaculture Design Deck, is to help us to make better, more effective decisions.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing for this field. I mean, and getting it out there, and just, providing it for free, and just open source for other people to learn this really important information. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about it, man.
The podcast is so awesome. I'm a huge fan. And this idea that we can generate dialogues and share them with other people to generate further dialogues. This podcast is like a ripple where positive and uplifting and intelligent ideas are going out in the world like memes and doing work. And so I see this has a really positive impact, and I'm excited to play some small part in this global generation of positive ideas that you're doing.
Thanks again for listening to the Lifting the Iceberg podcast. You can find out more about Delvin by going to visionarypermaculture.com or by following visionary_permaculture on Instagram. You can stay up to date on any new podcast at liftingtheiceberg.com or by following Lifting the Iceberg on Facebook and Instagram. Podcast available on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. Thank you to Alexis Spatty for designing the graphics for this podcast. You can find her at alexisspatty.com. And thank you to Carusu for the soundtrack Stay With Me. You can find Carusu on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud.